Didn't it? Hello, Westward Expansion Part 2. The Great Plains is where we're going to start. So this is where the largest group of Native Americans lived, about two-thirds of them. The Great Plains were basically Missouri to the Rockies, east to west, and North Dakota to Texas, north to south. The northern half had the Flathead, the Blackfeet, the Crow, the Arapaho, the Northern Cheyenne, and the Sioux. The South had a lot of those tribes that had been relocated. The Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Seminoles, the ones you find in them country songs. You also had the Pawnees, the Comanche, the Kiowas, the Southern Arapaho, and the Cheyenne. Most tribes had bands of 300 to 500 warriors, governed by a council but welcomed community input. The Comanche were the largest, 7,000 members, 13 bands. They tended to worship a primary god called the Great Spirit. They believed that spirits were found in everything of creation: the earth, plants, animals, stars, moon, the sun. You'll have some sacred places like burial ground mounds. They are sacred to them. They have shamans, which actually is the term we use. The real word is Wakan, W-A-K-A-N, led the religious ceremonies, healed the sick, and basically decided where to hunt. This could be done through, reading the entrails of animals was one way. They will have settled villages near rivers, where they tended the fields, they hunted, and they fished. They will trade with white settlers. Other groups will be the Wichitas, the Pawnees, the Dakota Sioux, the Omahas, the Osage, and the Arkansas. The large tribes began to use the horse, and some will adopt a migratory lifestyle. They can now follow the buffalo. Buffalo are very important, as we saw in the video. In 1800, there were 30 million buffalo, and the Native Americans used most parts of the buffalo. Migratory tribes became dominant and began exacting tributes from smaller tribes. Many plains groups glorified battles, but also respected acts of charity. So that's kind of a look at the plains. We're going to get back to the wars here in a minute. So I mentioned before, there's going to be a lot of migration. And part of that is, as I said, gold is discovered in California. By the 1850s, thousands have come across the 2,000-mile Oregon Trail. You probably played that. It was a big game on the the Apple IIe and C when I was a kid. Never did make it. I always died of dysentery. So thousands came attracted by books and pamphlets. It was very popular for recently freed slaves. A man named Henry Adams led a group of former slaves, 20,000, to Kansas. They were called the Exodusters, and it marked the last time anyone willingly went to Kansas. I kid. Native-born whites were the largest group to actually move west, however. They wanted larger plots of land. Some came to work for the railroads. Some were soldiers who had been deployed in the West and just stayed. One of the biggest groups were the Mormons. This was a religious group founded by Joseph Smith in 1830. Very uniquely American faith, I would say. Basically, if you don't know the story of Joseph Smith, let's see if I can get myself in trouble here. According to Smith, he was visited by the archangel, I think Gabriel, maybe Michael. Never can remember. Anyway, the archangel comes and says, "Yo, Joseph, did you know that Jesus came to North America and hung out over here?" And Joseph Smith's like, "Wow, that's pretty cool. I wish I knew more about that." And the archangel was like, "It's written down. So what you need are these golden plates, and it'll let you transfer it. You go dig them up, and you can, fill it out." And so Joseph Smith goes and finds it, and he writes it out, and he gives it to a friend of his to see what he thinks. South Park does a good episode of this. And basically, the man's wife was like, "How do you know he's just not making this up?" And so he's convinced, the friend is, to say, oh man, he lost it. If you go ahead and reproduce it, no harm, no foul. So Joseph Smith goes away for a while, says he talked to the archangel. He said he's mad, won't let him actually read that original text again. But there's a second one that's pretty close. So, he'll let him read that one. And those become the first two books of the Book of Mormon. This group, which will believe in polygamy, in fact, some sects still do. They won't. They were persecuted, and Smith took his band to Illinois in 1844. That is where Joseph Smith will be killed. We saw that in the video. The Mormons then went further west. So in 1846. So the idea was that Jesus came over here to, intermingle with a tribe. Now, you might think, wow, that sounds very pro-Native American. Well, it's actually not. It has this tinge of racism to it. Basically, what Joseph Smith says in the Book of Mormon is that Jesus was actually over here with one of the lost tribes of Israel, and that they were basically lily white, which makes absolutely zero sense. That they'd be white, not that they'd be here necessarily. And the reason they're not here today is because the Native Americans, the red man, rose up and killed them. And in fact, that's actually why God cursed them with red skin. So there's a certain underlying racism involved. And, it'll actually go to African Americans too. They actually won't give African Americans full membership in the church until 1968. Now, it's not to say they don't do some good things. Don't get me wrong. So they leave Illinois in 1846. We see why. They settled near the Great Salt Lake in Utah. At the time was under Mexican rule. That's why they chose it. They wanted to get the hell out of the United States. In 1850, it becomes a U.S. territory. They were pleased with that, let me tell you. By 1865, there are 20,000 more Mormons living in the area under a theocratic local rule, Brigham Young. The church controlled most private property, businesses, and public service. In fact, in Utah, Salt Lake City, they actually still own all the sidewalks. That's why a gay couple was arrested for public displays of affection a few years ago. Eventually, more and more non-Mormons came into the area. The federal government condemned polygamy. It was officially ended in 1896, though there was a group of Mormons, including Mitt Romney's grandfather, who fled to Mexico so they can continue to live their have their multiple wives. And in some parts of Utah, you have these places where you really shouldn't go, where they still practice polygamy, and there's actually some really horrible issues with child brides and things like that. I won't get into it, but if it interests you, you should check it out. So that's the Mormons. 2 million immigrants from other countries also moved west. They wanted free or less expensive land, or to work on the railroad or in the mines. We began to see enclaves of different ethnic groups. By 1860, 30% of Minnesota was foreign-born, 66,000 Germans, 62,000 Norwegians, and 39,000 Swedes, which makes sense. They come from a cold part of Europe, and that's the coldest part of the United States. During the polar vortex, it was actually colder in Minnesota than it was on Mars. Excuse me. You also will have thousands of Irish immigrants in Butte, Montana. And by 1900, it was the most Irish town in the United States. You don't think of that when you think of Montana. There will be conflict and tension among different groups. Chinese immigrants were often the victims of violence. By 1880, there were 75,132 Chinese in California, with another 30,000 or so in the West. You might wonder, wow, how they have such a precise number. Well, they kept close tabs on the Chinese immigrants so that they could basically, round them up really at any time, honestly. The Chinese were accused of taking jobs and lowering wages. In 1885, there was an attack on Rock Springs, Wyoming, where 28 Chinese miners were killed. 1887, 34 were killed in Hell's Canyon, Oregon. The railroads will bring 2 million immigrants to the West between 1870 and 1900. And they said there were room for millions of immigrants in California, especially after the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1887, which permanently barred Chinese immigration to the country. The railroad will bring development between 1860 and 1900. Agricultural output will soar, most of the growth taking place in the West. Our agricultural output was 1.6 billion, we'll say bushels, I don't know. In 1860, it'll be 4.3 million in 1900. We also have the emergence of the steel plow. We talked about that with industrialism. The agricultural schools, the spread of the railroads will allow farmers to sell to a national market. Many farmers, however, will face hardships, had to deal with unpredictable weather patterns. As I mentioned on the plains, they had high rain totals from 1878 to 1886, and then went back to the more normal drought conditions. They had to deal with swarms of insects that attacked the crops, basically all the plagues of the Bible. Wild fluctuations in prices made more abundant crops actually led to lower prices, which could be bad. And in fact, many will be pushed from their farms. It turned out that the conditions in the West were really better for large farms, what we call agribusiness today. Plains life, as we saw in the video, could be very lonely. In 1867, to approve the lot of farmers, a man named Oliver H. Kelly formed what was called the Patrons of Husbandry, or the Grange, which was a social and educational society promoting fellowship, fraternity, and education. They shared ideas through newsletters and lectures and became a powerful political group. We saw that in the Industrial Age. They won many political offices, and they tried to limit the power of the railroad. Now, next topic, cattle. Video does a great job on this, so I won't say too much. Cattle from Texas. In 1866, we began to see the long drives from cattle to market over 1,000 miles because there were so many cattle in Texas, they had to. The drives will be less needed once the railroads came about, but it gave us the image of the cowboy. Now, of course, what we think of as a cowboy really isn't very accurate, as we saw in the video. We look at old westerns and it's all John Wayne and everything else, but cowboys were African Americans, they were Hispanics, they were all kinds of different types of people. In fact, cowboy is actually kind of an ethnic slur in a way. That's how it got its name. So it gave us an idea, but it also took away that form of life when the railroads got more prevalent. The gold in California and the silver in Nevada created many mine towns. Some people got rich, most people didn't. Mining will scar the land, which isn't surprising, right? In fact, you still have out west, you actually have abandoned mine towns. They would kind of, during the boom, they'd show up and they'd expand, and then when the mine was out, the town basically becomes a ghost town. I always wanted to visit a ghost town. Apparently, there's actually a ghost town in the I want to say Smoky Mountains. I saw some pictures of it. A former student of mine, took pictures of on Facebook where, you're just walking the trails and all of a sudden you're in this abandoned town. Has anyone been there? Check it out and tell me about it. So westward expansion will cause problems for Native Americans. Duh, right? In 1851, Congress passed the Indians Appropriations Act, which set aside tracts of land in Oklahoma Territory as reservations for dozens of tribes. The Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed by the Sioux and other tribes. and these treaties said that most of central and northern plains were off limits to the whites if they would allow the whites to freely cross the Oregon Trail. Obviously, it does not hold up. White hostility became the norm and began forcing the Native Americans off their land. The government began to revise the treaties, shrinking Indian land. Indians began to resist. We have the Sand Creek Massacre on November 29th, 1864. The army will kill 200 people, 200 Indians, mostly women and children, mutilated their bodies, and took their scalps. Now, we think of taking the scalps as basically a Native American thing, but that's really not the case. Disease will also take its toll. And one of the problems is they cannot come up with a united front against the white incursion. On the plains is where we're going to see most of the fighting. The federal government continued to sign treaties including the Medicine Lodge Treaty, the Second Fort Laramie Treaty, which ended something called Red Cloud's War, which was caused by plans to build forts along the Bozeman Trail in Wyoming and Montana to protect whites who sought. They were built to protect whites who were going across and trying to make money. It guaranteed Sioux ownership of the Black Hills and hunting rights in South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana, barring white people from those lands. How well did that hold up? Well, the Black Hills are known for something pretty important to us. That's where Mount Rushmore is. So we found gold on their land, so we took it and we put our faces of our presidents in their sacred mountain. So the treaties continued to be violated. There's Red River War in 1874. Whites were not kept off the reservations. The Army crushed a rebellion in the spring of 1875, basically ending resistance in the Southern Plain. When, as I mentioned, gold was found in the Northern Plains, the Black Hills, the government demanded the Sioux vacate their hunting ground and return to the reservation. The Sioux refused. The Army launched an attack. The 7th Cavalry under Lieutenant George Armstrong Custer thought that there would be a few hundred Indians in his path. There were close to 2,000. That was the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He separated his soldiers, and the 7th Cavalry was wiped out. I think there were like 4 survivors and a horse. Further west, Indians had the same problems. After 1876, increased pressure to move to the reservations. The Nez Perce agreed, but 1/4 refused, including Chief Joseph. Under the leadership of Chief Joseph, 750 fled to escape the army. 550 were there were women, children, and the elderly. They put up a 1,400-mile flight, wanted to get to Canada. They defeated the army several times along the way, got within 40 miles of Canada before they had to surrender. That's when Chief Joseph says, "I shall fight no more forever." Now, I always wondered, why not just let them go to Canada? It's someone else's problem at that point, but I guess they were afraid they would come back. In the Southwest, we had the Apache Wars led by Geronimo. He's more than a song or something than being jump. He escapes many times, but his final surrender comes in 1876. Another group who will be treated poorly will be the Hispanos, who were basically Mexicans who were caught on the other side of the border after the Mexican War. Some will begin to look for a solution to the Indian problem, as it were. Congress will pass in 1887 the Dawes Civility Act, broke up the reservations. The idea was they wanted to assimilate the Indians into white Christian culture. The idea was 160 acres of reservation land went to the head of each household. The rest of the land would be sold. Ideally, the profits would go to education. The problem is, once they were assimilated, the idea was they would apply for citizenship, except for the Supreme Court will later torpedo that in Ogawa versus the United States. The land that went to the Indians were actually poor quality because they kept the good stuff to sell. They used the profits to set up boarding schools where they actually forced Native American children from their homes and sent them to these different schools across the country. I grew up from about 10 miles away from one called Great Crossings. One thing they would do is when the Native American students would come in, they would force them to take a more white name. So you always had a lot of Henry Clay, such and suches, and Thomas Jefferson's, this and that, and George Washington's. It did more really to destroy Native American culture than anything else. We will have the ghost dance movement in the 1870s and 80s, which will lead to the Wounded Knee Massacre. The idea was if you can learn to dance a certain way, then the white man's bullet can hurt you. It didn't really help. Last thing, hopefully the video will not mess up on me. The West will become kind of a mythological place, not only for us today, but for people at the time. You have people like Annie Oakley and Buffalo Bill who went to the East and did Western shows. You have dime novels. Zane Grey, Mark Twain wrote about the West. You have historian Frederick Jackson Turner giving us what is called the frontier thesis, which said that going west is what shaped American culture and character and made us the country that we are today. I want you to think about that and let me know what you think of that. Anyway, that's all I have on the West. Next video will be the Gilded Age.